The insurance company called me a little after noon, right in the middle of a warehouse shift in Dallas. I was standing near Dock 6 with a scanner in one hand and a clipboard tucked under my arm, listening to a driver complain about a delayed pallet when my phone started buzzing in my pocket. I almost let it go to voicemail. Unknown number. Middle of a workday. Usually that meant spam or somebody trying to sell me something I didn't need. Instead, I stepped away from the noise and answered. The woman on the line sounded calm, practiced. She said she was calling about a claim that had been filed on my wife Emma's vehicle after a minor accident the night before. She asked if I could verify some details. For a second, I didn't say anything. I just stared through the wire glass of the loading bay door at the white heat rising off the concrete lot. Emma hadn't mentioned an accident. Not that morning. Not the night before. Not even in passing. I asked the representative where it happened, and she gave me the name of a street on the other side of town. A place with no reason to belong to my wife's routine. Not near her fitness studio. Not near our apartment. Not near any friend she'd ever mentioned. The woman kept talking, asking if Emma had made me aware of the damage, if I knew whether anyone else had been in the car. I heard the words, but they were coming from farther away now. Because before I even answered, before I asked for the report, before I had anything solid in my hand, I felt it. That quiet, heavy shift when something breaks and doesn't make a sound. I said I need a copy of everything. She told me how to request it. I thanked her like this was routine, like I was just another husband handling paperwork on a Tuesday. Then I ended the call and stood there in the warehouse silence that only shows up when your own thoughts drown everything else out. A claim on a street she never mentioned. An accident she never told me about. And a feeling in my chest that said, plain as daylight. Something had already broken. Emma and I had been together for 11 years by that point. Long enough that most things in our life had settled into a rhythm that didn't need much discussion. I worked at a logistics warehouse just outside Dallas. Early mornings, long shifts, predictable problems. Trucks late, inventory off, paperwork stacked higher than it should be. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady. I knew what each day would ask of me before it even started. Emma worked as an admin at a fitness studio across town. Her hours were lighter, more flexible. She'd leave after me most mornings, come home before or after me, depending on the day. She liked it there. Said the environment was positive. People always in a good mood, always moving. At home, things were simple. We had dinner most nights at the same small table by the window. Nothing elaborate, whatever was easy after a long day. Conversation stayed light. Work stories, small complaints, plans that never really changed. Weekends were quiet. Groceries, laundry, maybe a movie neither of us paid full attention to. There wasn't tension. Not the kind you notice, anyway. But there were small things. Sometimes she stayed out later than she used to. Not often enough to feel like a pattern at first. Just enough to register, then pass. She'd say she was meeting a friend from the studio. Someone new. A group thing that ran long. Other times she'd come home in a mood I couldn't place. Not guilty. Not nervous. Just lighter than usual. Like she was carrying something good she hadn't decided to share. I remember noticing it once while she stood at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone with a small smile she didn't explain. When she saw me looking, she locked the screen without thinking and asked what I wanted for dinner. I didn't press. That was the pattern back then. Things would happen, small enough to ignore, and I'd let them pass. Not because I didn't see them, but because there was no clear reason to stop and question everything over something that didn't fully exist yet. 11 years teaches you how to live inside assumptions. You trust the routine. You trust the person. You trust that if something mattered, it would be said out loud. So I didn't ask about the late nights. I didn't ask about the names I hadn't heard before. And I didn't ask why certain details always stayed just out of reach. At the time, it felt like stability. Looking back, it was something else entirely. The police report came through 2 days later. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit in my inbox through most of the morning while I worked, finishing tasks that didn't require much thought. There's a certain kind of delay you allow yourself when you already know the direction something is going to take. Not avoidance, just pacing. When I finally opened it, I read it once without stopping. Then I read it again, slower. Date, time, location. All of it matched what the insurance company had told me. Late evening. Other side of town. A stretch of road that didn't intersect with anything in our life. Then I saw the line that hadn't been mentioned on the call. Passenger, Alex. No last name I recognized. No connection I could place. Just a name sitting there like it had always belonged. I didn't react. Not immediately. I just leaned back in my chair and let the rest of the document settle into place around it. Minor damage. No injuries. Statement taken on site. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have forced its way into a conversation at home unless someone chose to bring it up. And she hadn't. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the accident. Not the location. The decision to say nothing. I went back through the timeline in my head. That night. What she told me. She'd said she was out with a friend from the studio. Nothing unusual. Nothing specific enough to question. But now there was a name. Alex. And once that name existed, other things started to shift around it. Late nights that used to feel random started lining up in a way they hadn't before. The areas she mentioned, when she mentioned them at all, sat closer to that side of town than I'd realized. The small gaps in her explanations didn't disappear anymore once the conversation moved on. They stayed. I didn't confront her. There wasn't anything to gain from that yet. Instead, something quieter happened. I stopped taking what she said at face value. Not in a loud way. Not in a way that would show. On the surface, everything stayed the same. Same routines. Same conversations. Same tone. But underneath that, a line had been crossed. And once that line moved, everything on the other side of it started to look different. I didn't need to prove anything yet. I just needed to stop believing it automatically. After that, I stopped looking for explanations. Not all at once. It wasn't a decision I made out loud or even fully recognized in the moment. It just settled in. Like something inside me adjusted its position and didn't bother asking for permission first. Before, when something didn't add up, I'd fill in the gaps automatically. Give it the benefit of the doubt. Assume there was a reasonable answer I just didn't have yet. That's how 11 years works. You build a system where things resolve themselves without needing to be pulled apart. That system stopped working. I still listened when she talked. She'd come home, set her keys down in the same spot by the door, move through the kitchen like she always did. She'd tell me about her day. Someone at the studio running late. A scheduling issue. A conversation that didn't really go anywhere. I'd nod. Respond when it made sense. But it didn't land the same anymore. There was a separation now between what she said and what I accepted. The words still existed, but they didn't carry weight the way they used to. They just passed through. I noticed it one night when we were sitting across from each other at dinner. She was explaining why she'd be out later that week. Something about helping close up after an event at the studio. She gave just enough detail to make it sound structured, routine. I watched her while she talked. Not suspicious. Not confrontational. Just observing. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't trying to understand her explanation. I was measuring it, quietly placing it next to everything else I knew and seeing where it didn't fit. That was new. That was the break. On the surface, nothing changed. We still ate dinner at the same table. Still moved around each other in the same shared space. Still spoke in the same calm, familiar tones that had defined most of our relationship. If someone had walked in, they wouldn't have seen anything different. But underneath that, something had already separated. I stopped asking why. Stopped trying to connect the emotional side of it. Because the moment I saw that name in the report, it stopped being about confusion. It became about clarity. Not the kind you talk through. The kind you build quietly, piece by piece, without letting it show before it's complete. Once I stopped trying to understand it, I started paying attention instead. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't follow her. Didn't check her phone. Didn't ask questions designed to trap her in a contradiction. That wasn't necessary. There was already enough in front of me. I just hadn't been treating it like information. So I started with what was already there. Our joint account. Credit card statements. The kind of things most people glance at once a month and forget. I began looking at them the way I looked at inventory logs at work, line by line, date by date, without assumptions. At first, it didn't look like much. Gas stations on the west side of town. Small restaurant charges. Nothing large enough to stand out. Nothing unusual on its own. But when I lined them up against the calendar, they started to form a pattern. The dates matched her nights out. Every time she said she was meeting someone from the studio, there was a transaction within a few miles of that same street listed in the police report. Not always the exact same place, but close enough that it stopped being coincidence. I wrote it down. Just a simple list at first. Dates, times, locations. No conclusions attached to it. Just facts, the same way they appeared on paper. Then I added mileage. Her car didn't have a tracker, but distance shows up in other ways. Fuel frequency, fill-up amounts, the timing between stops. I started estimating how far she was driving based on what she used. It lined up, consistently, across multiple weeks. I didn't rush it. I let it build. Some nights, she came home later than usual, moving quietly through the apartment like she didn't want to disturb anything. Other nights, she walked in lighter, the same way I'd noticed before, carrying that unspoken energy I couldn't place back then. Now I didn't need to place it. I just needed to record when it showed up. There was a receipt I found one evening while taking out the trash. Folded, half hidden between paper towels. A restaurant on the same side of town. 2 entrees. A timestamp that didn't match anything she'd told me. I didn't bring it up. I added it to the list. By then, I wasn't looking for a single answer anymore. I was watching a structure take shape. And the more I paid attention, the less room there was for doubt. It wasn't about catching her. It was about understanding exactly what had already been happening, without needing her to explain it. At a certain point, it stopped being just about what she was doing. Up until then, everything I had stayed contained inside the space between us. Her movements, her explanations, the pattern that had formed without her realizing I was watching it take shape. But once the pattern was clear enough, the situation changed. It wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. I took a day off work and met with a lawyer downtown. Nothing dramatic. No long story, no emotional breakdown. I brought documents, statements, dates, the police report with Alex's name on it. He didn't react much while I talked, just nodded, asked for clarification where it mattered, and took notes in a way that told me he'd seen this before. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and explained how things worked in our state. Adultery wasn't just a moral issue, it had legal weight. It affected division of assets. It affected support. It turned something private into something measurable. That was the first time I saw it laid out like that. Not as a betrayal, as a set of consequences. He told me what would matter, what could be used, what needed to be documented clearly and consistently. No assumptions, no speculation, just verifiable facts tied to financial impact. I already had most of it. That's when I realized the way I'd been handling it, quiet, methodical, wasn't just instinct. It was exactly what this required. Before I left, he asked one question that shifted things again. Do you know anything about the other person? I told him what I had. Just a name. Alex. A passenger in a car that shouldn't have been where it was. He nodded and said it might be worth finding out more. Not for confrontation. For context. So I did. It didn't take long. A name, a workplace connection through the fitness studio, a few public records. Enough to place him. Enough to understand how their paths crossed. And then something else surfaced. Alex wasn't alone either. He had a fiancée. No indication she knew anything about it. No signs, at least not publicly. Photos, dates, a timeline that overlapped cleanly with the one I'd been building on my end. I didn't reach out to her. Not yet. I just added it to the structure. Because by then, this wasn't about reacting to what Emma had done. It was about understanding the full scope of what had been set in motion across more than just one relationship. And once you see it at that level, you stop thinking in terms of emotion. You start thinking in terms of outcomes. She called me later that night. It was close to 11. I had already shut the lights off in the apartment and was sitting in the dark with just the kitchen light on behind me. The phone vibrated once on the table before I picked it up. Her name on the screen didn't feel the same anymore. I answered without saying anything first. She spoke quickly, asked where I got the report. Not angry, not defensive, just unsettled, like she'd realized something had moved outside her control. I told her the insurance company contacted me. There was a pause on the line. I could hear her breathing shift, trying to find a rhythm that would steady whatever she was about to say next. I was going to tell you, she said. I didn't respond to that. Instead, I reached over to the folder I'd been keeping on the table. Everything was there. Printed. Organized. Not for her, but for clarity. I started with the date of the accident. Then the location. Then the name. Alex. I didn't ask who he was. I just let the name sit there between us. She tried to fill the silence. Said it wasn't what it looked like. Said it was complicated. That they were just talking, that things got out of hand, that she didn't know how to bring it up. I kept my voice even. I moved to the next point. A restaurant charge from 3 weeks earlier. Same side of town. Same time frame, she told me she was out with a friend from the studio. Then another. Gas station receipts. Distances. Dates that lined up cleanly with nights. She came home late. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't interrupt her when she tried to explain. I just continued. Each detail placed exactly where it belonged. At some point, she stopped trying to explain. The tone changed. The space between her words grew uneven. I could hear it before she said anything, before the first crack in her voice showed up. Then she started crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet collapse on the other end of the line. I didn't react to that either. I stood there, listening, but not participating. Because by then, this wasn't a conversation. It was a sequence. Facts laid out in order. And whatever she was feeling on the other side of that call, it didn't change any of it. When she finally asked what I wanted to do, I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit long enough to make it clear. I wasn't deciding anything in that moment. I already had. After that call, there wasn't anything left to discuss. I didn't follow up. Didn't check on her. Didn't reopen the conversation to give it a different ending. Everything that needed to be said had already been laid out, and none of it depended on how either of us felt about it. From there, things moved on their own. The paperwork I had already started organizing became part of something larger. The lawyer handled the filings. I provided what he asked for: statements, receipts, timelines, anything that connected behavior to measurable impact. There was no urgency in it. No rush. Just a steady process. Emma tried reaching out a few times in the beginning. Messages that shifted in tone. First explanations, then apologies, then questions about whether we could talk in person. I read them, but I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left that required conversation. The facts were already in place. Once the legal side picked up, the structure became even clearer. Her spending during those months wasn't just personal anymore. It was documented use of shared assets tied directly to the timeline I had built. Every dinner, every trip across town, every charge that lined up with a night she said she was somewhere else. It all connected. And in our state, that connection mattered. Adultery didn't sit in the background as a personal issue. It influenced outcomes. It shifted how things were divided. It changed what she was entitled to and what she wasn't. I didn't argue for it. I didn't need to. The documentation spoke on its own. There were hearings, but they were procedural, structured, focused on what could be verified, not what could be explained away. Her side tried to reframe parts of it, said the expenses weren't what they looked like, that the relationship hadn't been what I implied. But the pattern didn't leave room for interpretation. Dates matched, locations matched, amounts matched. And once those things line up consistently, the rest becomes unnecessary. The outcome reflected that. She lost any claim to alimony. A portion of the assets shifted based on the documented misuse of shared funds. And beyond that, there was repayment. Money traced directly to those months, assigned back with precision. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No final arguments. Just numbers, entered into a system that doesn't respond to emotion. By the time it was finished, there was nothing left to adjust. Everything had already settled into place. I moved out on a Thursday. Not because the date meant anything, just because it was the first day everything lined up. Lease signed, keys ready, paperwork already filed, and moving forward without me needing to be present for every step. I didn't take much. A few boxes, clothes, documents, things I had brought into the marriage that didn't carry any shared history. The rest stayed where it was. Furniture, kitchenware, anything that felt tied to a version of life that had already ended. The apartment I moved into was smaller. One bedroom, plain layout, nothing extra. It was quiet in a way I hadn't realized I needed until I was standing inside it with the door closed behind me. No background noise. No second set of movements. No need to account for anyone else's schedule. Just space. I set things up slowly. Not all at once. A chair by the window. A table that didn't need to match anything. The basics, arranged without much thought beyond function. Emma called once while I was there, a few days after I moved. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was different this time. Not explaining, not asking questions. Just talking. About how things had gotten out of control. About how she didn't expect it to turn into what it did. There was a moment in her voice, something lighter, almost disconnected, when she mentioned Alex, like the reality of it hadn't fully settled yet. I deleted the message without saving it. By then, the financial outcome had already been finalized. The number was exact. $287,000. Not as a single event, but as the total impact of everything that had been traced, calculated, and reassigned. Assets adjusted. Repayments structured. Losses accounted for in a way that couldn't be reinterpreted or undone. I didn't feel anything when I saw it. No satisfaction. No sense of balance being restored. Just recognition that this is what it added up to. That this is what it cost. From a distance, I heard through mutual contacts that she didn't take it seriously at first. That she treated parts of it like it would settle differently. Like something might shift back in her favor if she just waited it out. But numbers don't move once they're set like that. They don't respond to explanation. They don't adjust for regret. In my apartment, none of that followed me. There were no reminders beyond what I chose to keep. And for the first time in a long while, everything around me matched what I already understood. Simple, final, and quiet. Time passed the way it usually does when there's nothing left pulling at it. Work stayed the same. Early mornings, steady problems, predictable outcomes. I kept my routine, but it felt different without the extra layer of uncertainty sitting on top of it. No second-guessing conversations. No quiet adjustments to things that didn't quite add up. Just what was in front of me. The apartment stayed simple. I didn't add much. Didn't feel the need to fill space just to avoid it feeling empty. It wasn't empty. It was clear. Every now and then, something would remind me of how things used to be. A restaurant we used to go to. A street I hadn't driven down in a while. But it didn't pull me back into anything. It just passed through, the same way everything else does when it's already been resolved. I heard updates about her less and less over time. Not because people stopped talking, but because it stopped mattering enough to ask. The last thing I heard was that she was still dealing with the financial side of it. Payments structured out over time. Adjustments that didn't leave much room for anything beyond what was necessary. $287,000. That number didn't change. And neither did what it represented. Some stories don't end with closure in the way people expect. No final conversation. No clean explanation that ties everything together. Just a set of facts that settle into place. And once they do, there's nothing left to revisit. You just move forward with what's left. And keep it simple. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.